So we're continuing on with the DLC rankings, today covering all 14 of the brand new sorceries, which that is not that many compared to the incantations. Honestly, in this DLC, there's not really much intelligence options to begin with, which is kind of weird, but thankfully some of these options are really good. Now, as always, this is going to be a PvE based list, and I'm not going to be speaking about locations due to spoiler reasons, so if you did want to know the location of a particular spell, just ask questions in the comments. Starting off at the bottom, we have Mantle of Thorns. Now this spell for 9 FP and a little bit of HP, you cover your entire body in a bunch of thorns, of which when you roll into an enemy, you can do like 5 damage. I don't know what From Software's obsession is with covering your body in thorns and being able to roll to do terrible damage, but they feel the need to include it in every single game, and now we got it as a spell. Yeah, I would never use this thing, but you will be glad to know that it does stack with the Briar armor, and it does like stack multiple times to where you can get some respectable damage. Now, I mean respectable damage for like thorn rolling. It's definitely not going to be viable damage at all. Number 13, Miriam's Vanishing. This spell for 9 FP lets you have this cool iframing dodge, and the iframe dodge actually does get you a lot of iframes. However, the starting up frames are way too long to the point where you can just never really use it as a reactive dodge. And if you did want to use it to try and dodge those really annoying AoE attacks that some bosses have that might have lingering hitboxes, things like Val the Indomitable could just work better. But this spell does have one very specific use, and that's halfway through the dodging animation, you actually can start to cast your spells, and by the time that you actually exit the dodge, your spell is almost already fully casted and you can just go ahead and just use the spell. Now this type of strat might be more useful for like PvP. In a PvE setting, it's going to be very situational to the point where I really wouldn't bother using it. It would definitely be a lot more useful if I had quicker starting up frames. Number 12, RELLANA'S Twin Moons. This spell actually does make you become airborne and just shoot out a bunch of these like moon AoE projectile attacks in this cool 3 hits combo. Now the combo itself can do some okay amounts of damage, does 30 stance damage in total, but the problems with this spell is that you get 0 hyper armor, so you get hit one time, you come crashing to the ground. The AoE itself is very short range, so being able to have this long animation, no hyper armor, short range AoE, that's like just never gonna work out, like ever. And worst of all yet, this spell consumes 47 FP and takes up 2 slots. Like even if you do land the entire 3-hit combo, there are going to be other spells in this game that are much faster, consume less FP, and can do like just as much damage. Like some of the other moon-based sorceries can literally do just as much damage at a much further distance, and they can actually debuff enemies to make them take more magic damage. This thing doesn't even get that effect. So yeah, hopefully it gets buffed to where it gets more hyper armor and have a larger AoE. Number 11, Cherishing Fingers. This is going to be another short-range AoE spell that does not get any hyper armor. Now, thankfully, when you do get staggered throughout the animation, the AoE is still guaranteed to come out, so you actually can get your damage still. But for how much range the AoE has, how little damage it actually does do, it's not really worth the risk. The 20 FP cost is not too bad, but there are going to be other spells on this list that consume less FP than this, or just as much, and just do way more damage at a further distance. Even if you do have this thing fully charged with the Godfrey's icon and the specific type of staff that you find in the DLC that can boost these sorceries by 15%, it's still not really worth it. One change I would like to see is if this thing could get more stance damage, because when fully charged, it only gets 15 stance damage, which is just not good enough. So if it can just get added hyper armor and just more stance damage, that would be really cool. Number 10, Mass of Putrescence. Now this is going to be a spell that's very similar to Cannon of Heimer. It does have this very long casting animation to shoot out this cool like lobbing attack that can actually explode in a nice AoE. Now the differences being is that Cannon of Heimer is cheaper, does more damage, can send enemies flying, and do more stance damage, whereas Mass of Putrescence can actually get Frost, so it does have its own specific use, but there are going to be plenty of spells in this game, even some that you see on this list, that can also proc Frost, do almost just as much damage and be much more consistent while having a cheaper FP cost. Like it's fine to have a high damaging spell that has like a long casting animation, but you can't also make it be very expensive too. Number 9, Glintstone Nail. Now this is going to be another just basic projectile attack that you get for the sorceries that does magic damage, which sorceries get plenty of those things already, but this one is not going to be useless because it might be the most FP efficient projectile sorcery in the game. Because no other cheap sorceries can actually be fully charged, and this one can. Only consumes 10 FP, goes pretty far, does have some very aggressive tracking, and the damage can be really good. Now if you did just want to melt enemies or have high amounts of DPS, this is obviously not going to be the spell, but it is very efficient. Number 8, Vortex of Putrescence. This is going to be another Ghost Flame spell, meaning that it actually is going to have a faith-based requirement, of which this one is going to have 26 faith. So if you do have a pure intelligence type of build, this is not going to be for you. But this spell is actually still somewhat decent. It does shoot out a nice Ghost Flame AoE attack, which yes, it is still going to be doing magic damage. The AoE does cover a nice amount of range, the casting speed isn't too long, it can proc Frost very quickly, can do some nice damage, and the fact that you're doing all that in a pretty solid AoE means that you get very good crowd control. But the problem being for me is that it consumes 29 FP and takes up 2 slots. There are going to be other spells in this game that can also just proc Frost just as fast in a nice AoE, like Zamor Ice Storm, and there'll be other spells that you can see on this list that can just do more damage for that same FP cost. But it is still going to be a very easy to use Frost-based AoE spell. Number 7, Rings of Spectral Light. This is yet again another Ghost Flame type of spell, meaning it's going to get a little bit of a faith requirement. Also do Frost build up too. But this spell actually do value it a lot because it is very efficient. Only 14 FP, can do some nice damage. You can fully charge it and it will proc Frost. Now, unfortunately, the Frost buildup is not going to be that high. So if you did want to proc Frost, there are other spells that are going to do it much quicker. But this one can do it at a nice distance. And also the projectile is a delayed little animation. So enemies that like to dodge and input read and move around, this one can actually hit them pretty nicely. Now, unfortunately, there is going to be a spell on this list in Glintstone Trio that can also work very similar to this, but just do more damage. And that doesn't have a faith requirement. So I might just prefer that one overall. But this one does consume a little bit less FP, so it's not going to be useless. Number 6, we have Glintstone Nails. Now, this is going to be a spell that just shoots out a bunch of these magic nail attacks that have some very weird, like tracking, gets zigzagging all over the place. Does have very aggressive tracking when fully charged, to the point that it can just straight up just 180 and hit an enemy from behind. Now, this type of aggressive tracking might be comparable to things like Star Shower or even Stars of Ruin and Ancient Death Rancor. Those things are going to get better tracking and just hit those quicker and smaller enemies more consistently. But Glintstone Nails can just do more damage and probably consume less FP in most cases too. And also from my testing, it actually does do 24 stance damage if all of those nails hit, which is more than all the spells that I just mentioned. Now, yes, the total overall damage or DPS is not going to be as good as some other projectiles in this game, but it is very easy to use. Number 5, Gravitational Missile. Now, this spell for 18 FP does shoot out this gravity bolt that periodically over time does suck enemies in towards it, and after a bit it actually does explode to do some nice damage. Now, this a little bit of like shockwave after effects over the few seconds that it actually does last. Obviously, it doesn't do amazing damage, but the whole purpose of the spell is to keep enemies stun locked and just keep them in that location to where you can just clean them up with other weapons or other spells, and while they're just stun locked, you can just do amazing damage. It isn't going to hit that many times that quickly, so against the more mobile types of enemies, they might be able to get away, and obviously enemies that cannot get staggered, they're just going to completely ignore it. But you can just still use it as a way to just do some passive damage over time, or some passive stance damage over time, because the total combo, when fully charged, can do upwards of 20 stance damage. Now, the only reason I'm not going to put it higher on the list is because there is going to be another spell I'm going to talk about that works somewhat similar, but the explosion just comes out a bit quicker and just can send enemies flying in basically the exact same effect and just do more damage. So I'm just going to like that one a bit more, but this one does have better stun lock potential. Number 4, we have Glintblade Trio. Now, this spell is just going to be an upgraded version of Magic Glintblade. Doesn't consume much FP, does amazing damage, and the major benefit of this spell is that it does have a delayed effect to where when enemies like to dodge and move around, it's just going to end up hitting them anyway. And Glintblade Trio just shoots out 3 of these projectiles. Now, no, it's not going to be doing 3 times as much damage. From my testing, it only does about 5 to 10% more damage, but it only does consume about 5 more FP, and it can do about 10 more stance damage as well. When fully charged, it actually can do about 18 stance damage, which is actually pretty good for a spell that you can easily spam. Now, no, it's not going to be doing this job as good as something like Knight's Comet can do, but not many things are. Number 3, we have Fleeting Microcosm. Now, this spell actually does summon this cool black orb that just tracks right towards the player. Actually just spawns directly underneath them. Goes very far. Enemies don't even like react to it when it's coming underneath them. So therefore, you don't have to worry about enemies dodging or input reading. And it does have a little double attack. The first one just pulses, does a little bit of a staggering effect, and the second one just explodes in a very large AoE that can hit multiple enemies very nicely and do some very solid damage. This spell can also just be fully charged to make it do even more damage. And actually is going to be a staff in the DLC to just put in your offhand to make it just do 15% even more damage. And as you see in the gameplay, I actually don't even have it in my hand. So I actually can just be doing more damage in this instance. But as you can see, bosses are still just getting destroyed. It is not that big of a deal. But this spell can actually serve as one of the better crowd control spells because it just does go straight to that location of which where you aim it, and it will just send all these enemies flying. And probably best of all yet, this only consumes 26 FP. Number 2, we have Blades of Stone, which this is going to be a gravity-based spell that does do pure physical damage, so it is going to be good when you go up against those enemies that are like resist to magic or weaker to physical. But basically how it works for 18 FP is that it just spawns a bunch of these gravity rocks directly underneath the enemy, and it does some nice damage. But the best part about it is its fully charged state, because when fully charged, it can just hit 3 times and do roughly 25 stance damage. But the fact that it can hit 3 times means that it can just do amazing damage, and for only 18 FP. And these 3 shockwave effects actually do track towards the enemy as well. It's not going to be like the most aggressive tracking and doesn't really track that far. But if enemies do move a bit slightly to the left or the right, it actually will try and meet up with them. And against smaller enemies, it will just stun lock. Now the only downsides I can say is that it does have a 48 int requirement and take up 2 slots, but you do get this spell in the DLC, so at that point it's not going to be a big deal because yeah, this spell honestly does amazing damage. Number 1, Impenetrable Thorns. Oh my goodness. Very much like yesterday's video, how I talked about the number 1 option being broken. Yeah, this number 1 option is also just as broken. They basically took the Thorn sorceries from the base game and just cranked it up to 11. This just does ridiculous damage, goes so far, and just does such insane blood loss build-up. I don't even know what's even going on here, how they even let this thing come to pass, but we have it, and I'm just gonna take it. But yeah, for 15 FP, you basically just beat the entire game. It shoots out these like 3 thorn-based projectile attacks that like track towards the enemy, and upon impact, they just explode in this ridiculous amount of damage and like upwards of 400 blood loss build-up, which means that a lot of enemies are just going to get bled out in just 1 hit. And this spell can just go so ridiculously far as well. Like it just has insane distances, but best of all yet is using it at point-blank range, because using it at point-blank range means that those 3 projectiles are all guaranteed to hit. And if that happens, basically what you see on the screen, like everything just dies. And this is a thorn-based sorcery, so it's going to get boosted by things like the Staff of the Guilty, the Alburic set. It's going to be doing magic damage, so just put on the magic boosting things. And yeah, it's a GG. Did I mention only 15 FP? So yeah, add it to the list of things that are going to get nerfed soon. Anyway, that is the video now done and complete. Tomorrow we will be covering the incantations, so definitely do subscribe for that one. And also do follow me on Twitch as well, because there's still a lot more testing to be done, and I'm going to do them on stream. Anyway, catch you guys around. Bye!